So back in the first millennium, we learned how to program computers. Didn't take us long to figure out that we needed some tools like test automation, but it was actually the Agile community in this millennium that taught us about the test automation pyramid as they recognized how important test automation was. So the test automation pyramid is essentially an architecture for understanding the different kinds of testing that we can do and how they fit together. The idea of a foundation and building on that foundation. So there's foundational kind of tests like unit testing. Yeah, that's the most foundational kind of testing we should be automating, our unit testing. But what does that mean? Well, remember the word, unit, by itself. So the idea of unit testing is we test things by themselves before we build it into an application. Who does that, right? Not very many of us. But what it takes to do it is to actually write testware so that we can actually test individual pieces by themselves. This is a radical idea that we're finally coming back to. I did it way back when. Writing stubs, writing harnesses, writing whatever testware we need in order to really get that 100% test coverage. But when we do that, that then allows us to lay that foundation of good solid code that does precisely what we expected it to do and what we planned for it to do. 100% code coverage does that for us. What do we build on that foundation? So the next layer up of the pyramid then is our interface testing. Testing the actual interfaces themselves. I don't mean slam it all together and run a functional test and, hey, if it worked, they must have worked, right? I mean focused testing of interfaces. Like unit testing, that takes a specialized approach. And generally, it means we're going to have to write testware again. Yeah, testware again. We're going to have to write stubs. We're going to have to mock things out, right? If we're using somebody else's interface, mock it out, whatever. We have to write testware in order to do a good job of actually testing to be sure the interface meets the interface contract. But when we do, now we have clean code and clean interfaces, and that sets us up for the next layer of the pyramid, which is functional testing. Right, we finally get around to doing functional testing. But unlike the way we normally think about doing automated functional testing, don't go through the GUI. What we want to do is expose all the functionality through APIs so that we can do all of the functional testing, we can automate all the functional testing without the messiness of trying to do it through the GUI. Then we have this idea of, okay, now we know the functionality is working. What do we build on top of that? Now we can actually test the GUI itself. And now we're not actually just using the GUI to get to the functionality. We've already tested the functionality. We know it works. So now we can focus in on actually testing the GUI. Make sure every button, every field, every widget does precisely what we intended for it to do. And now we have a foundation of a fully tested application for, what do you build on that? That's what we actually use as our basis for doing manual testing. Now, manual testing is often going to be necessary. There are certain things that people's eyes need to look at. You can't automate every kind of test. But we want to build this foundation of fully tested application through automation and then do the manual testing of the things that a person needs to look like on that. Now, the horizontal axis of the pyramid is also speaking volumes to it. It's basically telling us how many test cases do we expect to see at each of these layers of the foundation. You can see unit testing is the biggest one. If you're going to get to 100% code coverage, that's going to take a lot of tests. Interface testing, of course, well, it depends on how complex your interfaces are, probably a lot. The functional testing, probably less, but depends on the functionality of your application, but we expect it to be less. GUI testing, probably a lot less. And of course, we want the manual testing to represent the smallest number of test cases just because it's so labor intensive. So that's kind of what we expect from a number of test cases standpoint, but that goes hand in hand with the other vertical axis, which is, as we are down near the bottom of the pyramid, we are talking about test cases that are relatively simple, straightforward, which means they're easy to write, they're easy to maintain, they're less likely to be brittle or to break when minor things change, and they actually tend to run faster as well. As you move up the pyramid, the tests become increasingly more complex, which means they're harder to write, harder to maintain. They become more brittle. They take longer to run. And yeah, false negatives, where the test doesn't find a problem, but there actually is a problem. And that's the main reason why we want to have as much of the testing down at the bottom of the pyramid as we can.